Good afternoon, everyone. My story today is going to take you a little bit farther afield than the history itself. If you're a fan of the TV show Bones or CSI or any of those, you're going to be seeing human remains today in this presentation. So just so I don't trigger somebody, there are pictures of crania, there are pictures of long bones, etc. in this. This map that we're looking at here was actually drawn by Lieutenant Casper Collins on the orders of his father, Colonel Collins. This was drawn before, obviously, the Battle of the Platte Bridge. So as we move through this, I'll be making some references to this as well. I don't know what that was. There we go. Okay, in case you don't know where you're at, we're right here. Fort Casper is just a little ways over that way, about 2 miles, 2.5 miles away from us. This is the location, of course, of the the soldiers that were stationed at what was Platte Bridge Station at the time. Wasn't named Fort Casper until after the Battle of the Platte Bridge. So just to give you an idea here, this is a recent Google map of the general area of Casper. There's Platte Bridge Station right there. And you see the Poison Spider route, you see the Red Buttes route. These are routes along the Oregon Trail. And one of the reasons that this fascinates me so much is that little spinning star right there was my home from about 10 years old.
Oh, wow.
So I remember that being built, Fort Casper grade school being built, and I remember digging up things like wagon bows and 1840-something English halfpenny out of the backyard of that residence. I lived there until I was about 16 or 17. So I have a real interest in this. This was back in the day when your parents used to kick you out and tell you to go do something. And of course, my doing something was going to the Platte Bridge Station, Fort Casper, by that point, and wandering up and down the sand hills around here. So I've got a real vested interest in this. Well, the Upper Platte River crossing, the location of Platte Bridge Station, has a long history. We don't know exactly where the Mormon Ferry was, but it was relatively close in here. In 1859, Gennard built a trading post, started his river bridge. The Pony Express came through this area. Then there was the 1861 telegraph line, 1862 Platte Bridge Station, and then in 1865, after the battle, changed to Fort Casper. By the way, they would have called it Fort Collins, but there was already a Fort Collins elsewhere. So, and in 1867, of course, the location was abandoned. They moved some of the buildings elsewhere onto other military reservations, and some of them were simply decommissioned by the Indians, if you will. Okay, so here we have Platte Bridge Station itself. Again, another overhead from Google. You see the reconstruction of Platte Bridge up here, right in here. This is the compound that Ellen and the folks were talking about, being standing on top of, being able to see from or see out to the Battle of the Red Buttes, which is different than the Battle of the Platte Bridge Station. And then here is the location of the burial that we're going to talk about. This location, actually, if you go out and you stand at where the restrooms are at the back side of the parking lot, you're actually just about where that burial came out. So in June of 1990, while they were doing some leveling on that ground, They were using a front end loader, my understanding, I wasn't there. They were using a front end loader to try and level some of those sand dunes out there, and they ran that front end loader into a low sand dune. And when they picked that front end loader up, part of a coffin fell out of it. And they basically scraped off the upper portion of that coffin. And still laying in the coffin was a majority of the body. The cranium had been moved, but was still there. And it was recovered by the WAS and Dr. George Gill, who was the physical anthropologist at the time. Danny, was the state out there on that?
I don't think so.
No? This is one of the photographs from the HR, from the Human Remains Repository, that's associated with this individual. Well, there were a number of places that we knew or that were known to have burials in them. The blue circles with the red dots around them are reported locations that we knew or that were known either from the accounts, the contemporary accounts, or this one down here, this one right here is actually the location of the Fort Casper Cemetery now, where some of the individuals that were recovered from elsewhere have been reburied since the 1930s, 1938, I believe it was. This is our guy that we're talking about today, and then there were two other burials recovered right here. Actually, I should say there were two burials recovered here. We're only going to talk about one. And then there were two others recovered down here, late 80s, early 90s. So the biological profile, I am a forensic archaeologist, if you will. I deal with dead bodies, burials, aspects of that kind of nature. So I tend to give real forensic views on some of this stuff. We know that the individual that came out was male. All of the markers on the cranium, on the pelvis, everything said male. His ancestry was most definitely European or European American. His ancestors came from Europe. He was not anything else. His stature is given, when we calculated using the long bones, his stature is about 5'4"1/4", and that's plus or minus an inch and a half. So he could have been anywhere from like 5'2 3/4" on to 5'6 3/4", something like that. Put his age based on epiphyseal fusion, based on the long bones fusing together, and on the pelvis at 20 to 30 years old. This is just the basic profile that really law enforcement wants from every forensic aspect. When they have a body that they can't identify, they want to know things like that. Another thing that became very apparent not so quickly afterwards is that the cause of death was blunt force trauma and gunshot. Initially, I didn't do the analysis initially. There was another student at the time that did, and he called gunshot trauma as the main cause of death. It remained that way until about 2000, maybe 1998, when I went back in and started looking at it, and now the major cause of death, gunshot may have contributed, but it was blunt force trauma that actually killed this individual. So getting a little more into the forensic aspect, this is the clavicle. This is this bone that goes right across in front of the shoulder here. You'll notice that this individual has great big fossa, great big deep excavations here. These are typically associated with strenuous activity in the pectoral girdle. So this guy was doing something that resulted in micro tears and eventual excavation into that rhomboid fossa on the clavicles. He was also involved in something that caused some osteophytic activity, meaning bone growth, abnormal bone growth on the pelvis. This is the sacrum in the back, and the pelvis to the side, and you can see some abnormal bone growth right here, where the side of the pelvis, the innominate, has overgrown the sacrum. Again, this indicates a lot of stress and strain on that body part. This is an interesting one. A fused distal and medial phalanx of the toe. So it's supposed to be in two pieces. Obviously it's not. It could be idiopathic. It could have occurred simply because it occurred. He could have stubbed his toe and it could have fused that way, or he could have been stepped on by a horse and it fused. But anyway, just kind of a little anomaly on the body that shows up fairly well. He also had a pathology or something to the fifth digit, his little finger. That little finger was canted off to the side, like it had been broken and healed improperly, something like that. But it may have affected his grip. So we don't really know much about that. It's not mentioned in any historical records, obviously. They don't talk about little things like that. This is the cranium. Now, originally, the original investigator thought this area was blown out by gunshot wound, meaning that it had been shot in the side of the head and it had blown out, basically removed the face. The point back here was interpreted as an entry wound. So, shot in the back of the head, it had basically removed the face. That's not quite what happened. When we look at, this is again, this is this injury right here, from the interior, from inside the cranium. Notice the beveling here and around here. This is actually older, or not older, is not the same age as this beveling. This is probably the result of some of the excavator damage. So this, however, is part of an original injury, probably one that either killed him outright or at least rendered him unconscious, and a big part. When we look at the front of the face, notice that all of this dark gray is missing bone. It's drawn out here in a little detail, so the nasals are gone, part of the eye orbit, the cheek on one side is gone. There's a photograph of the individual. And then all of this is detached bone, this light gray, so it's broken. And broken in such a way that you can tell that there was a blow, a blunt force trauma blow that came from this side and exited this side. A little closer view of some of that detached bone. You can see here that there is slight beveling on the interior. So not only did it come across, it was oriented into the face as well. The bone breaks in a very, very specific fashion. Almost like glass. You can predict how it's going to break along certain planes. So that's what we were doing in looking at this. This really indicates a very, very hard blow across this individual's face. When we started the analysis, or reanalysis I should say, in the late 90s, one of the things that you'll learn about bullets is that lead bullets especially leave something called bullet wipe on the bone. And that bullet wipe shows up in x-rays as bright white. There's no bullet wipe anywhere in this cranium.
Hold the mic up.
I'm sorry?
Thank you.
Yeah, there's no bullet wipe on anywhere in the interior of this cranium. We have a few different views, and usually bullet wipe would show up as bright white flecks where that bullet left lead adhering to the bone or other metal adhering to the bone. It doesn't show up here. So what looks like happened, there's a series of breakages called Lefort fractures that happen to the face. The face is buttressed really well and it's isolated. When you have a blunt force trauma to the face, it breaks in predictable fashion. And this predictable fashion is a combination of a Lefort 2 and a Lefort 3. So it removed most of the face and detached the maxilla. It was just hanging there. Now, in case you think that, this is still telling stories out of school, okay? In case you think that's not survivable, my ex-wife had a cousin who ran his face into a steering wheel in the 1950s. Gave him a Lefort 3, detached his face. The old country doctor up in Buffalo got a series of coat hangers and put his face back together. This is the 1950s. The guy's still alive today. He looks a little, but that's neither here nor there. He survived. I'm sorry?
You still have the coat on you?
No, I think they removed those after the face healed a little bit. Okay, so here's another view of that cranium. Again, that blow would have been coming out toward you. So very, very heavy. There's also a perifracture to the left ulna. Perifractures happen when you're trying to block something from hitting you. You throw that arm up in front of your face and the heavy blow hits the arm before it hits whatever you're trying to block. This is a typical perifracture. Has a butterfly type effect. Notice that it has the little wedge of bone here that was removed. What's interesting to me is that it has a fragment of metal adhering to it in the x-ray. That's what metal shows up like on an x-ray, just a bright white dot. And there's also nothing going on with the left radius. So it broke one of the two forearm bones, but it didn't break the other. So a glancing blow maybe removed that wedge-shaped fragment, and those remained in the grave with the individual during the time that he was buried. Well, this is not the Platte Bridge battle. This is another battle, okay? But you get the idea of that parry blow. Look at the guy trying to shield himself from that war club that the Native American individual is wielding. So you get the idea of the kind of thing that's going on here. During excavation, there was a 44 or 45 caliber bullet found in the back near the scapula. And this is a black powder round. This is not a bullet per se. This is a small round ball that is loaded in a black powder revolver or a black powder single shot pistol, one or the other. You can tell the direction of travel by the amount of deformation on that bullet. This is where it impacted something, probably our individual, and started to mushroom. You can tell the direction of travel was coming out that direction. Unfortunately, it's really kind of a crappy bullet. If you go back into the historic literature and start reading about what was going on at Platte Bridge Station the night before the battle, they were low on bullets. They had powder, didn't have many bullets. And so they were casting bullets the night before the Platte Bridge Station battle and the night before the Red Buttes battle. This is kind of what you'd expect to see if somebody were casting bullets in a big hurry and didn't care about whether or not it had air holes or impurities or whatever in it. This is not a very good bullet. Another thing that became very obvious pretty quickly is that the coffin that he was buried in was painted. So we have green, we have lavender, we have black, and we have white, all on these boards that are associated with this burial box. Maybe coffin isn't the right word. Rough box, something of that nature. A little different view of it. You get that bright yellow stripe there. Now, we should note that military wagons at this point in time were painted blue on the outside and guess what? Red on the inside. Military ambulances type thing. So this is not a military board, probably. Lots of metal with it. Most of them hand forged or at least cut. So we have cut nails and hand forged rivets, stock shoe nails, all of this kind of stuff incorporated into this box. Pieces of metal, like this is just really, really thin iron in a very random place. And then clinch rivets. These clinch rivets have relatively large heads, except the one that lost its head. Have relatively large heads, and then they're driven through boards, driven over, and driven back in to lock them down so they won't move. And then these, it took me forever to figure out what these were. This is actually a bow staple. This was driven through the boards and then clinched on the underside. What's that doing in a coffin?
Locking it.
Locking it, yeah.
Locking it from the bottom.
Yep. So just a sample of everything we got there. Were screws in there? Lots of different sizes of nails, cut nails, staples. That bow staple, well, several bow staples were actually pretty interesting. It wasn't until I started putting the thing back together that it finally clicked what was going on. They had taken the sides of a wagon and built a coffin out of it.
Oh, wow.
So we have a cross section here. See the coffin sides? There were two different kinds of wood. There was a pine, which is mostly the boards, pine here, and then there were oak cleats holding it together, which is pretty typical of wagons in that period. So all of these nails here, or all of these rivets here, are actually the clinch nails off the side that drove it through the oak, through the pine, and then drove them back. That was probably part of the original wagon construction. But then for the bottom, since they didn't have width that they needed, they took the bow staples and put two planks together by using the bow staples to drive them together. And then they put oak cleats across the bottom as well. Just a drawing of a wagon showing you the clinch nails, the pine boards, the oak boards, the bow staples. They actually put these light metal plates, which I didn't realize, makes sense now. They put these light metal plates on the back of the feed boxes to keep the horses or mules from cribbing, from chewing on the feed boxes. And this is a little later, 1865 versus 1890. But you see the painting on the wagon. Not much changed through the years in terms of painting wagons. In fact, you could pay to have your wagon painted when they were delivered to you back east. They were usually bare. They weren't painted. You had to pay to have them painted. And if you wanted to pay, then they would paint them any color that you desired, in any form that you desired. So somebody had a real love of blue and yellow and white and black on that wagon, or maybe more than one wagon. Who knows? The reason, aside from the color, that we know that it's probably not a military wagon, according to the historic record, once you started across the Platte at Platte Bridge Station, people began abandoning wagons left and right. They were everywhere. They could have all the pine and oak boards that they wanted, simply because people got to that point. They'd either lost family members to disease, or they lost animals, or decided that they were going to turn around and go home, or there were all sorts of different reasons, but there was a lot of abandoned wagons around that area. Go back to my own childhood, I remember disintegrated wagons out along the Red Buttes route from the late 1950s, somewhere in there. Okay, also buried with this individual were several buttons. These are, for those of you that are sewers, you know that a line is a measure of a button, right? So 27 line, 4-hole metal buttons. These are a little larger, usually used to close pants, things like that. And then there were a series of 22 line, 4-hole buttons. The military uniforms called for 22 line and 27 line buttons at the end of the Civil War. And remember, this is July, if indeed this individual is with the Platte Bridge Station battle. This is the end of July. The Civil War had formally ended a month or two before, but these folks were still being issued military clothing. So he's buried with what could be military buttons. So in July of 1865, there are about 70 men, maybe 80 men with the 11th Kansas that are there. The 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry also has a few men there, including Lieutenant Casper Collins, who didn't arrive there till the day before, I believe it was, something of that nature. And anyway, there were some 3rd U.S. Infantry. Everybody know what a galvanized Yankee is?
Confederate soldiers.
Confederate soldier that was pressed into duty with the promise they wouldn't have to fight their brethren, so they sent them out here to fight Indians. So galvanized Yankees. So there were galvanized Yankees there as well. 14 men, 15 men, something like that. All totaled, there was less than 120 individuals at Platte Bridge Station. So a lot of the information leading up to this tends to stress Chivington's massacre as being the trigger for what happened at Fort Casper. There were a lot of things leading up to it. Lean Bear was a peaceful individual, rode up to the U.S. Cavalry and was immediately shot because Chivington had orders from the governor of Colorado to kill Cheyenne, period. The Hungate family, who were ranchers or worked on a ranch, were killed by the Cheyenne in, that should be 64, not 54, I apologize. All of this led to increased hostilities across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado that culminated in Chivington's Sand Creek Massacre. Attacked a peaceful Cheyenne village down on Sand Creek. The more proximal cause, however, was what was his name, Colonel Lightfoot, hung a pair of Oglala minor chiefs for the kidnapping of Lucinda Eubanks, even though Lucinda begged them not to because these weren't the people that kidnapped her. They had ransomed her with the intent of bringing her to Fort Laramie to release her as a peace gesture.
Oh, wow.
And so Colonel Lightfoot arrested them and then hung them without trial. And that leads us up to the July 26th Platte Bridge Station fight and the Custer Battle. So the 11th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, most of them, this is an important distinction because most of them originally mustered in as infantry, meaning they were bigger guys. If you wanted to be in the cavalry, you had to be a little. They didn't want any big guys riding little horses. So they also included galvanized Yankees. The second muster at the end of 64 brought in mostly younger men and older men because everybody else had been either conscripted or enlisted or something already. These folks were armed with the 50 caliber Smith carbine. 5-year-old boy can throw a harder rock than this thing can shoot. It's a skirmish weapon. It's a short distance skirmish weapon. 20 to 30 grains of black powder, usually loaded either with a rubber cartridge case or a foil cartridge case. You could also just dump the powder in on top of the bullet and lock it and load it, but that resulted in even less powerful firing. They also had the 44 Remington cap and ball. This was standard issue, not just to officers, but a lot of the military men, privates, corporals, had this as well. Notice that it shoots 35 grains of black powder compared to the 25 grains in the Smith carbine. This thing was more powerful than the carbine was, especially given the size of the bullet, 50 versus 45. Contemporary drawing of Fort Caster, or Platte Bridge Station, and the men going out. You see Pastor Collins leading his group out here, the Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho warriors attacking. We have the cannon down here. A few folks out here trying to protect Collins's rear view. Didn't work so well. Or maybe it worked really well because after being surrounded by 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 warriors, 15 or 16 of these folks made it back. There were only 21 to start with. And they were going out to relieve Custer's train. Interesting story. I don't know if you've heard this about why Casper Collins, who was 11th Ohio, was leading a troop of 11th Kansas. It's because all the 11th Kansas officers knew there was a fight coming and reported for sick duty the day. Collins had already been written up for cowardice, for refusing to go out by himself.
I didn't know that.
And so he was doubly stung when the commander in charge told him to lead this. He had two choices: get written up again or go to what he knew, I think, was going to be certain death. Well, killed in the Battle of Platte Bridge that day was Casper Collins, Sebastian Naring, George McDonald, Moses Brown, and George Camp. These were all killed on the 26th. Only one or two of these individuals was actually recovered during the battle. Moses Brown was recovered supposedly after the battle, after things had cleared up off the battlefield. George Camp was actually recovered during the battle. This is in addition to all of Custer's men. And they lost another man, Private Porter of the 11th Kansas, trying to fix the telegraph line out to the, get my directions, out to the east of Platte Bridge Station. Okay, so here's what we know. We have blunt force trauma to the face, okay? Blunt force trauma to the left parietal. We have a perifracture to the left ulna, and we've got a 44 45 caliber lead ball in the back. Now let me take you back to a running account of Battle of Platte Bridge. Casper Collins wheeled his men and started riding back toward the bridge. As he was riding, the Indians were clustered so close around him that they couldn't fire their own weapons without hitting their own guys, which means that they were really packed in there. So all of these survivors came in not with gunshot wounds, but with lance wounds, knife wounds, axe wounds, those types of things. Something that you could actually swing and not have to worry about shooting your brother-in-law over there. As they're coming back in, Mr. Brown gets shot and falls off his horse. The accounts vary here. Some say that he got up and started staggering. Others say he got up and started running toward Platte Bridge, when an Indian warrior rides up behind him and hits him in the back of the head. He immediately falls down. The warrior jumps off his pony and starts wailing on Mr. Brown. Again, it says a hatchet in the historic record. What's the matter with hitting somebody with a hatchet in a battle? It sticks. You don't wail on somebody with a sharp-edged thing unless you turn it around. If you turn it around, then you have that pole, the back end of the axe. Well, a friend of Mr. Brown's, whose name is Friend, by the way, starts shooting at this warrior, trying to kill him, trying to get him off his friend. And nobody can seem to hit this guy. Of course, they're all firing either Spencers, repeaters, or they're shooting this 50 caliber Smith. Eventually, Friend manages to shoot the warrior. And Friend and another guy run out and grab Camp and drag him back to the lines at the bridge. He's the only one that is buried that day at Platte Bridge Station, according to the historic record. So we've got this guy who has a blow to the back of the head, who's been hit in the face several times, who's got a perifracture on his ulna, and has got a lead bullet in his back. Sound like anybody you know? All right, so here's the back. This is a trade axe. This is pretty typical of the time. If you look at that fold, this is actually a reproduction, but the diameter is almost exactly the diameter on the blow to the back of the head that knocked him down. Okay, so is Fort Casper number 3 Private George Camp, 11th Kansas? Well, what do we know? George Camp, I got into his military records, was born around 1845. There's a little bit of mystery. They didn't keep real good records back then. But around 1845, his stature is given as 5'6" in the military records. He's born in Nottoway County, Missouri, just a little south of where my great-great-grandfather is from. Well, Fort Casper burial number 3 is aged 20 to 30 years. We've got a stature that is well within the range of what he is. And we did oxygen isotopes of the teeth. Guess where he was born? Number 3. He's born in the oxygen isotope band that includes most of Missouri. So it's not definitive. There's lots of people born in Missouri, but it sure is suggestive. Well, I took to the Ancestry.com boards looking for relatives of George Camp. Took many years posting, trying to find things before Mr. Camp's great-great-great-great-nephew contacted me and said, hey, we never understood what happened to Uncle George. Could this be him? Could well be. We know they knew he was in the Civil War and had been transferred out west and never heard from him again. So on the one side we have William Camp, who is George Camp's brother, and on the other we have colloid type early photograph with no name associated with it. But the cupie, the hat, the uniform style is all consistent with that 1865, 1864 date. So what do? Well, we take the face of the individual and we take the skull and we try and overlay it. Notice in this view that, look at this chin. Look at this chin. This doesn't show, it works better on my 3D thing at home, but you get the idea. There is pretty good correspondence between the cranium and the photograph. Unfortunately, pretty good correspondence is not proof. All I can say is I can't rule out this guy as being George Camp. I also can't rule him in. At this point, I believe the individual that I was corresponding with has since passed. I do have other contact information if we can find the money to do DNA, and if we can get DNA out of this skeleton, that will prove once and for all whether or not this is actually George Camp of 11th Kansas that died at the Battle of the Platte Bridge Station, July 26, 1865. Okay? Thank you.